I never set out to be a giant killer, or a community champion, or anything more than a guy who fixes things for a living. My name is Sam, and I own a small contracting business. I specialize in renovations, the kind of work that takes a forgotten, broken-down house and gives it a second chance. It's hard work, dusty and demanding, but I find a deep satisfaction in it. I like tangible results, seeing a crooked wall become straight, a leaky roof become sound. I suppose that's why I bought the house on Chestnut Lane. It was a foreclosure, a sad, slumped-shouldered structure that had been empty for the better part of 2 years. The bank just wanted it off their books, and I got it for a price that was more of a whisper than a shout. The neighborhood was exactly what you'd picture for a place with street names like Chestnut and Maple. It was an older, established development from the late 70s, a mix of split levels and modest 2-story colonials. The lawns were mostly neat, the trees were mature, and there was a general air of quiet stability. It seemed like the kind of place where people borrowed cups of sugar and waved as you drove by. For me, it was perfect. It was close enough to the city for supply runs but far enough away that you could hear crickets at night. My plan was simple: pour my skills, my money, and my sweat into the foreclosure for a year, turn it into a home I could be proud of, and then just live quietly. I had no interest in neighborhood politics or local drama. I just wanted to fix my house, mow my lawn, and be left alone. My first few weeks were a blur of activity. I had a massive commercial dumpster delivered and parked it neatly at the end of a driveway, as far from the street as possible. I started with the gutting, tearing out stained carpets, water-damaged drywall, and ancient kitchen cabinets that smelled of decay and disappointment. It was messy, loud, and deeply satisfying. The neighbors were curious, of course. A few of them stopped by while I was hauling debris to the dumpster. An older gentleman named Arthur from across the street gave me a friendly wave and a thumbs up. A young family 2 doors down brought over a plate of cookies that I ate for lunch for 2 days straight. The vibe was good. It felt like I'd made the right choice. The governing body of our little enclave was the Chestnut Lane Homeowners Association. When I closed on the house, I received a thick booklet of covenants and bylaws that I skimmed with professional interest. Most of it was standard stuff: no unregistered vehicles parked on the street, lawns must be maintained, fences have to be a certain height. It seemed benign, a typical HOA set up to prevent anyone from painting their house neon pink or raising livestock in their backyard. I learned from Arthur that the HOA had, for most of its existence, been a pretty sleepy affair. They collected the modest annual dues, paid for the landscaping at the neighborhood entrance, and mostly kept to themselves. But he'd added with a slight frown that had changed a couple of years ago. That change had a name: Carol Peterson. She had moved in about 3 years prior, into one of the larger homes at the end of the cul-de-sac. According to the neighborhood scuttlebutt, she had immediately found the HOA's relaxed nature to be an affront to her sense of order. Within a year, she had maneuvered her way from concerned resident to board member to, ultimately, president of the association. Her ascension was, by all accounts, a masterclass in procedural warfare. She attended every meeting, pointed out every minor inconsistency in the minutes, and wore down the old, retirement-age board members with sheer, relentless persistence until they'd all but handed her the gavel just to make her stop talking. Once in power, Carol began to reshape the HOA in her own image. The first changes were small. She sent out a newsletter, professionally printed and glossy, reminding everyone of rules that hadn't been enforced in decades. The acceptable palette of exterior paint colors was suddenly narrowed from a broad spectrum of earth tones to 3 specific shades of beige. Mailboxes, she decreed, had to be a uniform model, a specific brand of black, powder-coated steel that cost $150. Holiday decorations were now subject to a strict timetable. They could not be erected before the 1st of December and had to be removed by the 2nd of January. Failure to comply would result in a written warning, followed by a $50 fine. Most people just grumbled and complied. It was easier than fighting. Who wanted a war with their neighbors over the placement of a plastic snowman? The community's general apathy was the soil in which her petty tyranny took root. People were busy with their jobs, their kids, their lives. They paid the new, slightly higher dues, bought the approved mailbox, and kept their heads down. This was the environment I was walking into, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just over the horizon. My focus was on joists and insulation, not on the burgeoning dictatorship at the end of my street. My first personal interaction with Carol Peterson happened on a Saturday morning about a month after I started work. I was on a ladder, wrestling a new sheet of plywood into place to patch a section of the roof sheathing. It was grueling work, and the sun was already beating down. I heard a sharp, commanding voice call out from the edge of my lawn. "Excuse me. You, up there." I looked down to see a woman in her mid-50s, dressed in crisp khaki pants and a polo shirt so white it hurt my eyes. Her hair was a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde, and her arms were crossed over her chest in a posture of supreme disapproval. She was flanked by two other board members, a nervous-looking man and a woman who seemed to be studying her shoes with intense interest. "Can I help you?" I called down, trying to keep the annoyance out of my voice. I was in a rhythm, and interruptions on a job site are a momentum killer. "I am Carol Peterson, president of the Homeowners Association," she announced, as if I should have recognized her on sight. "We need to discuss your project." She said the word project with the same distaste one might use for infestation. I sighed, secured my hammer in my tool belt, and carefully made my way down the ladder. I walked over, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of a dusty glove. "Sam," I said, extending a hand she made no move to shake. "What's the problem?" "The problem," she began, her eye scanning the state of my property with a clinical coldness, "is multifaceted. First, the dumpster. Article 7, Section C of the bylaws clearly states that any such container must be concealed from street view by an approved privacy screen." I blinked. "A privacy screen? For a temporary dumpster? It's going to be gone in a few weeks." "The rules do not specify a duration. They specify a condition." "That is violation number 1, she said, ticking it off on an imaginary list in the air. Second, the lawn. It is an absolute disgrace. It's overgrown with weeds and is bringing down the aesthetic value of the entire street." This was so absurd I almost laughed. With all due respect, the lawn looked like this when I bought the place. It's been neglected for 2 years. I'm gutting the inside of the house right now. Landscaping is phase 4. It's on the list, but it's not at the top. "The bylaws require continuous maintenance of all landscaping," she retorted, her voice as inflexible as concrete. "Your property is currently in violation. That is number 2. And third," she pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the front of my house. "The color of your front door. It's a faded, peeling red. That is not an approved color." I stared at the door. It was, indeed, a faded, peeling red. It was also the original door that I planned to replace entirely in a month or 2. I'm replacing the door. And the windows. And the siding. This is a full renovation. The current state of things is temporary. The current state of things is in violation, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. It was like talking to a poorly programmed robot that could only repeat one line of code. "You have received verbal notification. You have 7 days to rectify these 3 violations. If you fail to do so, official fines will be levied. $50 per violation, per day. I suggest you consult your copy of the bylaws. It is all in there. Good day." And with that, she turned on her heel and marched away, her 2 silent partners trailing in her wake like pilot fish. I stood there in my own yard, covered in sawdust and sweat, completely dumbfounded. A privacy screen for a dumpster. Fines for a lawn I hadn't even had a chance to touch yet. It was beyond unreasonable. It was insane. I looked at the dumpster, then at the weedy lawn, and then at the old red door. I felt a hot spike of anger, but it was quickly followed by a sense of weary resignation. This was the last thing I needed. I had a budget, a timeline, and a mountain of work to do. A war with a power-tripping HOA president was not a line item I had accounted for. I tried to be reasonable. That evening, I wrote a polite, professional email to the HOA board. I introduced myself properly, laid out the scope of my renovation project, and provided a rough timeline. I explained that the dumpster was temporary and that the landscaping and exterior finishes would be addressed in later phases of the project, assuring them that the final result would be a beautiful, well-maintained home that would be an asset to the community. I respectfully requested a temporary exemption from the cited violations, given the nature of the extensive repairs underway. It was a logical, calm, and respectful message. The reply came less than an hour later, and it was clear it came directly from Carol. It was curt and dismissive. "Dear Mr. Smith," it began, "the bylaws do not provide for exemptions based on renovation timelines. The rules are the rules for a reason, to maintain the standards of our community. The 7-day deadline stands. Sincerely, Carol Peterson, President." The sheer condescension of it was infuriating. The rules are the rules. It was the classic refrain of the petty tyrant, the person who hides their lust for control behind a thin veneer of procedure. I realized then that logic and reason were not going to work. This wasn't about maintaining standards. This was about power. She was making a point, establishing her dominance over the new guy on the block. For the next few days, I stewed. I considered my options. I could fight her, but that would mean diverting time and energy from the renovation. I could just pay the fines, but the thought of giving that woman a single dollar of my hard-earned money made my stomach clench. Or, I could comply. It grated on me, but it seemed like the path of least resistance. I needed to focus on the house. So, I spent half a day and a few $100s I hadn't planned on spending. I went to the hardware store and bought several sheets of cheap lattice and some wooden stakes. I built a flimsy, ridiculous-looking screen around the dumpster. It looked 10 times worse than the dumpster itself, a rickety fence to nowhere, but it technically concealed it from street view. Then, I spent 3 miserable hours in the hot sun with a weed whacker, leveling the jungle that was my front lawn. I didn't have time to properly reseed it, so I just scalped it down to the dirt. It was ugly, but it was no longer overgrown. As for the door, I just unscrewed it from its hinges, took it into the garage, and threw a coat of beige paint on it, one of the 3 approved beiges, naturally. It was a temporary door on its way to the scrap heap, but now it was a compliant temporary door. I finished just as the sun was setting on the 7th day. I felt angry and slightly humiliated. I had capitulated. I had let this woman bully me into wasting a day of my time and a chunk of my budget on pointless, cosmetic nonsense. I hoped that would be the end of it. I hoped that by demonstrating my willingness to follow her absurd commands, she would be satisfied and leave me to my work. I was wrong. It was only the beginning. My compliance didn't appease her, it emboldened her. She saw it as a victory, a confirmation of her power, and it only made her want to exercise it more. A week later, the first official letter arrived in my new, HOA-approved mailbox. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper, embossed with the Chestnut Lane HOA logo. It was a fine for $150. The violation? Improper storage of construction materials. I walked outside, trying to figure out what she was talking about. Leaning neatly against the side of my house, tucked away behind a large azalea bush and completely invisible from the street, was a small stack of lumber I had purchased for framing a new wall. It had been there for 2 days. I was livid. This was no longer about maintaining standards. This was harassment, plain and simple. She was actively looking for things to fine me for. I went back inside and fired off another email, this one less polite than the last. I pointed out that the materials were not visible from the street and were stored neatly on my own property. I attached photos to prove it. Her reply was, once again, swift and cold. Article 9, Section F. All construction materials must be stored indoors or within a fully enclosed structure. The side of a house is not a fully enclosed structure. The fine stands. Please remit payment within 30 days to avoid late fees and interest. I pulled out the thick binder of bylaws and flipped to Article 9, Section F. And there it was, in black and white. A ridiculous, overreaching rule that no one in their right mind would ever enforce on a major renovation project. But it was there. She had me on a technicality. It felt like being slowly strangled by red tape. The fines continued to arrive with metronomic regularity. A fine for my work truck being parked in my own driveway for more than 48 consecutive hours, because it was a commercial vehicle. A fine for a small pile of dirt I had excavated for a new porch footing, which was apparently an unapproved landscaping feature. A fine because the temporary plastic sheeting I had put over a window opening was not an approved window treatment. Each letter was a new jab, a new drain on my finances and my morale. The cost was adding up, but the psychological toll was worse. I started to feel watched. Every time I worked outside, I felt her eyes on me from her house down the street. The friendly, welcoming neighborhood I had been so excited about was starting to feel like a prison yard, with Carol as the warden. My dream of a quiet life was turning into a bureaucratic nightmare. The impact started to spread beyond my own property line. My dumpster, now hidden behind its ludicrous lattice screen, had to be emptied. The waste management truck arrived early one morning, and the driver, a seasoned pro, had a difficult time maneuvering the truck's arm around the screen. In the process of lifting the heavy container, the arm scraped against the flimsy structure, and one of the lattice panels cracked. 2 days later, I received a fine for a damaged privacy screen. The absurdity was reaching new heights. I began talking more to my neighbors, trying to gauge if I was the only one on her radar. I quickly discovered I was not alone. Arthur, the friendly gentleman from across the street, told me he'd been fined because his garden hose was not coiled in a perfectly circular fashion. And Maria, a single mother down the block, had received a warning because her children's plastic slide was visible from the street. She was told it had to be stored in the garage every night. The stories were all the same: petty, vindictive enforcement of obscure rules, creating a climate of fear and resentment. Everyone disliked Carol, but no one felt they could do anything about it. They were intimidated. She wielded the bylaws like a weapon, and people were afraid of the cost and hassle of fighting back. The breaking point for me came one rainy Tuesday. An elderly woman named Mrs. Gable lived in the house next to mine. She was in her 80s, a widow, and mostly kept to herself. Her house was a bit dated, but it was always neat and tidy. That morning, I saw an ambulance in her driveway. I walked over and learned from a paramedic that she had slipped and fallen, and they were taking her to the hospital to get checked out. They said she would likely be there for a few days. The next day, a notice was pinned to her front door. It was from the HOA. I walked over to read it. It was a formal warning. Her newspaper had been left in the driveway for more than 24 hours, a violation of the property tidiness clause. That was it. Fining me for nonsense was one thing. Harassing an 80-year-old woman while she was in the hospital was another. This had gone beyond a personal vendetta against me. This was a sickness. Carol wasn't just a stickler for the rules, she was a bully who preyed on people she perceived as weak or unable to fight back. My frustration hardened into cold, clear resolve. I wasn't just going to fight the fines anymore. I was going to fight her. I had to. It wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about defending a vulnerable neighbor and freeing an entire community from the grip of this petty tyrant. That evening, I made 2 calls. The first was to a lawyer my cousin had used for a zoning dispute. I explained the situation, the escalating fines, the harassment of my neighbors, and the incident with Mrs. Gable. He listened patiently. HOA law can be tricky, he said, his voice calm and professional. These associations are often granted a surprising amount of power. Fighting them on a rule-by-rule basis can be like a death by 1,000 cuts. You win one, and they just hit you with another. What you need is leverage. You need to find a way to challenge the very legitimacy of her enforcement, or better yet, her authority. He agreed to meet with me the following week. My second call was to a dumpster company. I cancelled the service for the one in my driveway and ordered a smaller one, requesting it be placed at the very back of my property, completely out of sight. It was an extra hassle, forcing me to haul debris in a wheelbarrow all the way to the back of the house, but it removed one of her favorite targets from the equation. It was a strategic retreat. I was done playing her game of whack-a-mole. From now on, I would be playing a different game entirely. My focus shifted. The renovation of the house continued, but now I had a second, more important project, the deconstruction of Carol Peterson's little empire. I started my investigation with the binder of bylaws. I read every single word, all 60 pages of dense, mind-numbing legalese. I highlighted every ambiguous phrase, every potential contradiction, every rule that seemed overly punitive or ripe for selective enforcement. I was looking for a weakness in the armor. During my meeting with the lawyer, Mark, I laid out everything I had found. He nodded, confirming my suspicions. A lot of these rules are legally questionable, he said. They're overly broad and subjective. The clause about the garden hose being a perfectly circular? That would never hold up in court. But she's not counting on it going to court. She's counting on you giving up and paying the $25. It's a war of attrition. Mark's advice was clear. We can fight these fines, but it will be expensive and time-consuming. The real power in an HOA isn't in the rules themselves, but in the people who wield them. Your best bet is to remove her from power. But to do that, you need more than just complaints from angry neighbors. You need proof of something serious. Malfeasance. Misappropriation of funds. A significant breach of her fiduciary duty, and so, the real hunt began. I started with the HOA's finances. As a homeowner, I was entitled to review the financial records. I sent a formal, certified letter to the HOA board, requesting copies of the annual budgets, monthly expense reports, and bank statements for the past 3 years, the period covering Carol's entire reign. Her response was predictable. She stalled. First, she claimed the request had to be formally approved at the next board meeting. Then, she said the treasurer was on vacation. Then, she sent me a heavily redacted, one-page summary of the budget that was completely useless. It was clear she was hiding something. Her resistance only strengthened my conviction that I was on the right path. While I waited for the financial battle to play out, I continued my work on the house. The gutting was finally finished, and it was time to start rebuilding. This meant tearing out old, crumbling plaster and lath from the ceilings. One afternoon, I was working in the small upstairs bedroom, pulling down sections of the ceiling. It was dirty, miserable work. I decided to clear out the attic crawl space above the room to prevent a century's worth of dust and debris from falling on my head. The crawl space was cramped and dark. I shone my flashlight around, cutting through the thick, stale air. In the far corner, tucked away behind a thick insulation bat, was a cardboard box. It was an old banker's box, brown with dust and age. I dragged it out into the light. I figured it was probably old tax records or forgotten photo albums left behind by the previous owners. I almost tossed it onto the debris pile, but my curiosity got the better of me. I sliced through the brittle packing tape with my utility knife and lifted the lid. It was not what I expected. The box was filled to the brim with paper. On top was a stack of letters, bound with a rotting rubber band. They were all from the Chestnut Lane Homeowners Association, and they were all addressed to Mr. Robert Miller, the man who had owned the house before me. The first letter was dated 14 years ago. The last one was from just over 2 years ago, right before the bank foreclosed. I sat down on an overturned bucket in the middle of the dusty, half-demolished room and began to read. It was like watching a man's life fall apart in slow motion, one passive-aggressive, bureaucratic letter at a time. The campaign started small, just like it had with me. A warning about grass being 1/4 of an inch too high. A notice about a trash can being left out for 2 hours too long after pickup. But it escalated, year after year. There were letters fining him for a small crack in his driveway. Fines for the paint on his window trim beginning to show signs of weathering, fines for a non-approved species of shrub planted near his mailbox. With each letter, Carol Peterson's name was at the bottom, first as a board member, then as vice president, and finally, as president. Her tone grew more and more aggressive over the years, the threats more and more severe. I found copies of his replies, desperate, handwritten notes pleading for understanding. He explained he was having financial difficulties after his wife passed away. He was working 2 jobs to try and keep up. He promised to fix the driveway as soon as he could afford it. Her responses were cold and clinical, always referring back to the bylaws, always demanding immediate payment. The fines piled up. Late fees were added. Interest was compounded. Then came the legal threats. The letters started referencing lawyers and property liens. Tucked into the bottom of the box was a thick legal document. It was a notice that the HOA had placed a lien on his house for failure to pay thousands of dollars in accumulated fines and fees. That lien was likely the final straw, the thing that made it impossible for him to refinance or sell, the final push that sent him into foreclosure. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a case of a power-hungry HOA president being a nuisance. This was a systematic, decade-long campaign of targeted harassment that had, in all likelihood, cost a man his home. Carol hadn't just been enforcing rules. She had been hunting him. She had hounded a grieving widower, buried him under an avalanche of paper and penalties, and literally driven him out of his own house. And now, she had started the same process with me. I carefully packed every single piece of paper back into the box. This was it. This was the leverage Mark had been talking about. This was more than just a collection of old letters. It was a meticulously documented record of abuse of power. It was a pattern. It was the smoking gun. My strategy, which had been defensive and reactive, suddenly became sharp and focused. I was no longer just defending myself. I was seeking justice for Robert Miller. The next day, I took the box straight to my lawyer's office. I set it on his polished conference table and said, "I think I found what we were looking for." Mark spent the next hour silently reading through the letters, his expression growing more and more grim. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low whistle. "This is astounding," he said, shaking his head. "This is a textbook case of bad faith and harassment. The sheer volume and duration of it, a judge would have a field day with this. This isn't just evidence against her, this is a character assassination in her own words." He looked at me, a new respect in his eyes. "Okay, Sam. This changes everything. We are no longer on the defensive. We are now on the attack. We're going to use this, but we have to be smart about it. A lawsuit is one option, but it's slow and expensive. A public airing of this laundry, however, that could be much faster and more effective." Our new plan was simple and ruthless. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. It was the one time all year that a large number of homeowners would be in the same room. According to the bylaws, any homeowner could request to be added to the agenda to address the community. I would be added to the agenda. In the meantime, Mark would use the threat of a massive lawsuit, citing the evidence in the box, to finally pry the unredacted financial records from the board. He sent a blistering letter to the HOA's legal counsel, a copy of which went to Carol, stating our intent to sue for harassment and informing them that we were now in possession of Mr. Miller's complete file. The effect was instantaneous. Within 48 hours, a thick package arrived at Mark's office containing every financial document we had requested. Carol had folded. She must have panicked, realizing the gravity of what I had found. She probably thought giving us the financials would appease us, make us focus on a settlement. She had no idea what we were really planning. For the next 2 weeks, I spent my days working on the house and my nights poring over those financial records with Mark and a forensic accountant he recommended. The picture that emerged was uglier than I could have imagined. Carol had been treating the HOA's bank account like her own personal slush fund. There were hundreds of questionable expenses. Large payments to a landscaping company for community beautification projects that, when cross-referenced with satellite maps, turned out to be extensive, high-end work done exclusively on Carol's own property. There were invoices from a contractor for common area fence repair who, it turned out, was her brother-in-law. The fence in question was her own backyard privacy fence. But the most damning discovery was the fines. The accountant found a clear and undeniable pattern. The vast majority of fine revenue collected by the HOA came from a small handful of properties, primarily those owned by elderly residents, single women, or, in the case of Robert Miller, people who were known to be financially vulnerable. The money collected from these punitive fines was then used to fund her pet projects and personal upgrades. She wasn't just a bully, she was a predator, using the power of the HOA to extract money from the weakest members of the community to enrich herself. The letters I found in the attic were not just a record of harassment, they were the paper trail of her extortion racket. We prepared our presentation meticulously. We scanned every letter from the box. We created charts and graphs illustrating the financial data. We highlighted the invoices for her personal projects paid for with HOA funds. We prepared a timeline that showed the correlation. A wave of fines against Robert Miller would be followed by a large payment for, say, a new stone patio for Carol's backyard, disguised as a common area improvement. It was a complete and irrefutable indictment. We had her, and she had no idea the axe was about to fall. The night of the annual meeting arrived. The community center clubhouse was packed. Usually, these meetings had a sparse attendance, maybe 15 or 20 people. Tonight, there were over 100. Word had gotten out that something big was going to happen. The atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. I saw Arthur, who gave me a subtle nod of support. I saw Maria, the single mom, holding her daughter's hand. I saw Mrs. Gable, back from the hospital and looking frail but determined, sitting in the front row. Carol stood at the podium, beaming. She clearly misinterpreted the large crowd as a sign of her popularity, a testament to her strong leadership. She opened the meeting with a glowing summary of her accomplishments. Under my leadership, she declared, our property values have never been higher, and our community standards have been rigorously upheld. We have created a neighborhood that we can all be proud of. She then moved on to the next agenda item, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Now, we must address the issue of compliance. Unfortunately, some residents believe the rules do not apply to them. Her eyes locked onto me. Mr. Smith, for example, has shown a consistent disregard for our community's bylaws, accumulating numerous violations and outstanding fines. It is this kind of behavior that threatens to erode the very fabric of our neighborhood. She was trying to publicly shame me, to make an example of me before I even had a chance to speak. It was a classic bully tactic. But I just sat there, my face calm, my hands resting on the thick binder in my lap. When she finished her tirade, she dismissively said, "Now, I see Mr. Smith has requested time to speak. You have 5 minutes." I walked to the podium, carrying my binder and the old, dusty banker's box. I placed the box on the table next to the podium where everyone could see it. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors, at the nervous anticipation, at Carol's smug, self-satisfied expression. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady and clear. "My name is Sam Smith. I'm the new owner of the house at 12, Chestnut Lane. Carol is right about one thing. I have had some disagreements with the HOA. But I'm not here tonight to talk about my fines. I'm here to talk about this." I lifted the lid off the banker's box. This box was left in the attic of my house. It belonged to the previous owner, Robert Miller. It contains every piece of correspondence he received from this HOA for 14 years. It tells a story. A story of a man who was harassed, fined, and ultimately driven from his home by this board and by its president. A murmur went through the crowd. Carol's smile faltered. I began my presentation. I put the first letter on the overhead projector for everyone to see. It was a simple warning, dated 14 years ago, signed by Carol as a board member. Then I put up the last one, the notice of the lien, signed by Carol as president. For 14 years, I said, my voice ringing with indignation, Robert Miller was subjected to a relentless campaign of fines and threats. He was fined for the color of his trim. He was fined for a crack in his driveway. He was fined into poverty. He was fined into foreclosure. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I thought, at first, that this was just a personal vendetta. But then I started to wonder where all that money was going. So, as is my right as a homeowner, I requested the HOA's financial records. Carol shot to her feet. This is out of order. This is a private matter? You have no right. Please sit down, "Carol," I said, my voice hard as steel. "You will have your turn." To my surprise, and hers, Arthur stood up from the crowd. "Let him speak," he said, his voice firm. A chorus of agreement rose from the room. Defeated, Carol sank back into her chair, her face a mask of fury. I turned to the financial charts. "Here is what I found," I said, clicking to the next slide. It showed a graph of the HOA's income. As you can see, over the past 3 years, nearly 60% of this HOA's revenue has come not from our annual dues, but from punitive fines. And who is paying these fines? My next slide was a list of names. Robert Miller, Mrs. Gable, Maria Sanchez, a dozen other names, all of them elderly, on fixed incomes, or otherwise vulnerable. And where did that money go? I continued, my voice rising. Did it go to paving our roads? Did it go to a new playground for our children? No, I put up the next slide. It was a copy of an invoice for $5,000 paid to Peterson Landscaping for common area shrubbery installation. Next to it, I put up a satellite photo of the neighborhood with a bright red circle around Carol's house. This common area was Carol Peterson's front yard. And a Peterson Landscaping? That's a company owned by her brother. The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing at Carol. Her face had gone from red with anger to ghostly white with fear. I presented slide after slide of damning evidence. The invoice for the fence repair, that was her own fence. The payments for board administrative costs that were traced back to her personal credit card statements, paying for expensive dinners and shopping trips. The pattern was undeniable and obscene. She had used her position to terrorize the weak and systematically loot the community's treasury. When I was finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, Mrs. Gable, her voice trembling but clear, stood up. "She fined me," she said, looking directly at Carol. "She fined me for a newspaper in my driveway while I was in the hospital after a fall. I have lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. This is my home. And you treated me like a criminal. That broke the dam." One by one, other people stood up, sharing their own stories of Carol's petty tyranny, of the threatening letters, the absurd fines, the constant feeling of being watched and judged. Her 2 board members, who had sat silently beside her, now looked horrified. They began inching their chairs away from her, as if her corruption were contagious. Carol's authority didn't just crumble, it evaporated. She tried to speak, to object, but her voice was drowned out by the angry shouts of her neighbors. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, for a friendly face, but she found none. She was utterly alone, exposed and condemned by the very people she had sought to control. She grabbed her purse, sputtered something incoherent, and fled the room, pushing her way through the crowd as people jeered. In the chaotic aftermath of her departure, Arthur took the podium. He called for an immediate vote of no confidence in Carol Peterson and the entire board. The vote was unanimous. He then proposed the formation of an interim committee to take control of the HOA's assets and to fully cooperate with a formal investigation. My name was the first one nominated. Before the night was over, a new, temporary board was in place, and the locks on the HOA office were being changed. The next morning, armed with our entire file of evidence, Mark and I, along with Arthur and Mrs. Gable, went to the district attorney's office. The legal process was swift. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the testimony of over 24 of her neighbors, Carol's case was open and shut. She was charged with multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and theft. Her brother's landscaping company was also implicated. The local news picked up the story, running a segment titled "Tyrant of the Cul-de-sac," complete with unflattering pictures of Carol and interviews with her furious neighbors. Her public humiliation was absolute. 6 months later, she pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, 5 years of probation, and was ordered to pay full financial restitution to the HOA, a figure that amounted to over $75,000. A separate civil suit was filed on behalf of Robert Miller, and the court ordered her to pay him substantial damages for the harassment that led to the loss of his home. All the fines she had ever levied against me and everyone else were officially nullified and expunged from the record. The illegal lien on my property, which she had filed in a final act of spite before the meeting, was thrown out. I was completely and totally vindicated. With Carol gone, a sense of profound relief settled over the neighborhood. The interim committee, which I reluctantly co-chaired, set about dismantling her oppressive regime. We rewrote the bylaws, stripping out the ambiguous and punitive clauses and replacing them with simple, common-sense guidelines. We held new, transparent elections for a permanent board, and a group of reasonable, community-minded people were chosen. The HOA went back to being what it was always supposed to be, a quiet, background organization that took care of the basics and otherwise left people alone. The changes were immediate and visible. People started talking to each other again. Kids' toys were left out on lawns. People planted flowers that weren't on an approved list. The oppressive sense of being watched was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community. The neighborhood didn't just return to normal, it became better than it had been before. We had all gone through a trial by fire together, and it had forged a bond between us. We weren't just a collection of houses on a street anymore, we were neighbors in the truest sense of the word. A couple of years passed. I finished the renovation of my house. It was no longer the sad, neglected foreclosure it had once been. It was my home, solid and beautiful, a testament to the power of a second chance. The work I had done had increased its value, and as the neighborhood's reputation recovered from the scandal, all the property values on the street began to climb again. One Saturday afternoon, I was at the local grocery store, picking up a few things for a barbecue I was hosting for some of the neighbors. As I was heading down the cereal aisle, I saw her. It was Carol. She had been released from prison a few months earlier. She looked diminished. Her perfectly coiffed hair was gone, replaced by a limp, graying cut. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a worn-out tracksuit. She looked older, tired, and defeated. Our eyes met for a brief second. A flicker of panic crossed her face, then resignation. She pushed her cart, which held only a carton of milk and a loaf of bread, and started to hurry past me. On an impulse, I said her name. Carol. She stopped but didn't look at me. She just stared at a box of Cheerios on the shelf. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For everything I looked at this woman who had caused me and so many others so much grief and anger. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, of satisfaction. Instead, I just felt a quiet sense of pity. Her little kingdom was gone, her power was gone, and all she had left was this empty, lonely existence. She had built her entire identity around controlling others, and without that, she was nothing. I know, I said simply. And I walked away, leaving her there in the aisle. I didn't forgive her, not really. But I was no longer angry. Her own actions had been her ultimate punishment. She had created her own prison long before the state had locked her in one. As I drove home, I reflected on the whole bizarre chapter of my life. I had bought that house just wanting to be left alone, to build a quiet life for myself. Instead, I had been dragged into a war I never wanted. But in fighting it, I had discovered something I didn't know I was looking for: a community. I had found good friends in Arthur and Maria and the other neighbors who had stood with me. I had helped restore a sense of fairness and peace to the place I called home. The lesson, I suppose, is that petty tyrants draw their power from the silence of good people. They thrive on apathy and intimidation. But when one person, even a reluctant one, decides to stand up and say enough, their foundations of fear can crumble with surprising speed. I never asked to be a hero. I was just a guy who wanted to fix his house. But sometimes, in the process of rebuilding walls and mending foundations, you find yourself fixing something much bigger than you ever intended. And there's a deep, quiet satisfaction in that, too. I pulled into my driveway, looked at my finished home standing proud and straight on its green lawn, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, completely at peace.